I hope you enjoyed the morning session. I certainly did. Great start to our conference. And enjoyed a delicious lunch. Thanks again to the Rothschild Foundation for just such a fantastic venue and facilities here. We're now moving to the afternoon. We've got some very interesting things to discuss with you. We want to make sure that we are measuring wealth as correctly as we can do, and to ensure that such metrics are being used. But a prior question is, where does it come from? And it is helpful when we think about what is wealth, how is it defined, how is it measured, how do we make sure that we're developing more of it, to ask the question, how is it created? And before we move to think about questions of inequality and on the management of wealth on sovereign wealth funds, delighted that we have Mariana Mazzucato, who is a professor of the economics of innovation at SPRU at Sussex, with us to talk to us about wealth creation and the entrepreneurial state. Now, I just want to tell you a little bit of an anecdote before I introduce Mariana. I suggested her at this moment to someone who will remain nameless in the organising team, and they said, "Who is this person?" And I said, "I'm surprised you don't know. She's really very good." Then she did lunch with the FT, and said person said, "Oh, this person looks really good." And I said, "Yes, we have her coming. Oh, this is fantastic." So anyway, Mariana not only does lunch with the FT, she does she speaks for TED. She probably does lunch with TED too, and is on the World Economic Forum's, what are they called, Council for Innovation. So she's written a book called The Entrepreneurial State, out in 2013, one of the FT's best books of that year, and is writing a book with another high-profile co-author, who may or may not be in the audience, on rethinking capitalism, which is to come out shortly. That's Michael Jacobs here. He is in the audience, I know. So, Mariana, with no further ado, please, you're very welcome. We're looking forward to hearing what you have to say about wealth creation and the entrepreneurial state. Thank you very much.
So I have my own timer, so if that one's wrong, I know. Right, so the contrast with the early morning session is huge, so hopefully you won't mind after your lunch to be projected into this new space. What I actually want to, there we go. What I want to focus on is how, exactly what Cameron just said, how the way that we talk about the different actors, and I really like the fact that we've already talked about ecosystems, so if you think of it, the ecosystem of different actors, public sector, private sector, third sector, and how they actually come about to create wealth versus some creating it, some just say redistributing it, actually matters a lot for measurement issues. And I actually want to throw out lots of questions more than give some answers. And really, I mean, if you think about the objectives also when we're measuring GDP, it's obviously targeted towards getting a particular type of growth, and there's all these words out there called, inclusive growth, we want smart innovation-led growth, we want sustainable growth, and that also implies a certain direction, not just a rate of growth. And the question is, what has been over time, if you think of sort of the technological change that has driven productivity increases and growth, in fact, under modern day capitalism, what has actually been the role of public sector institutions? And from now on, when I say the word state, just in your head say network of different public institutions in an economy. This is not top-down sort of planning. What has actually been the role of these public institutions in creating wealth itself? And I prefer to actually use the word value, so in creating value versus just redistributing it. And is it just setting the rules of the game and leveling the playing field? Is it just de-risking, incentivizing, and facilitating the private sector? Is it just, and of course as economists this is our words, fixing different types of market failure problems, whether it be basic research, financing, infrastructure, education, or is it something else? Is it just stabilizing aggregate demand, which of course is very important in the macroeconomic context, or is it, again, something more interesting? And I want to argue that it's something much more interesting, because instead of thinking about the role of public institutions as just fixing all sorts of different market failures, could it be that actually what has gone on in those periods of time, in those particular regions of the world where interesting things happened, was a process of actively shaping and creating markets, not just fixing them? And I know this is a bit of a comic slide, but we are constantly presented with this image that all the really interesting stuff by the wealth creators happens here. In fact, when the Labour Party lost the election, and this is a left, supposedly left-wing party, losing the election in May 2015, they came out with this analysis, which is, we didn't embrace the wealth creators, right? So these are the wealth creators. This is the state. There is all its different types of institutions which are supposed to actually be facilitating, incentivizing, de-risking this process inside business, which creates the actual wealth. And what I want to do is sort of dismantle that and ask then what are the implications for the kind of conversations we're having in this room. And so again, unfortunately, there's not many interesting things said by economists in terms of anything that's non-market failure fixing, but surely if you've read The Great Transformation, am I supposed to be sitting here near this microphone? Sorry, that's very hard. Carl Polanyi, who wrote A History of the Market Process Itself, was very explicit that actually policy actively forced into existence the market, so the national capitalist market. He's great when he also differentiates local markets and international markets, which have been around forever, but the national capitalist market, which is what we study as economists, was actually forced into existence through different types of policies. And Keynes himself, I think, had really interesting things to say that have not been picked up by modern Keynesians in terms of what it means to sort of think big. And if you sort of combine, thinking big through public policy with, again, this kind of market shaping, market fixing framework in Polanyi, very different things emerge from just thinking about the state and its role in stabilizing aggregate demand, which we need counter-cyclical spending, yes. Now, apologies for this self-promotional slide, but when your book is translated into German as Das Kapital, it's kind of interesting to look at it every now and then. But Das Kapital of the state, so the capital of the state. So what I want to sort of encourage you to think of, how are some of the questions we're asking today, how do they change when we actually think of the state as a lead investor, as an investor of first resort, not last resort? The state, through this network of different public institutions, which, by the way, in the UK, I would include the BBC, how does that change the way that we think about risks and rewards? How does it think about the kinds of public institutions we need, but even how we capture and evaluate and then assess what these institutions are doing? For some reason, my stopwatch is not moving. Oh, there we go, good. Okay, so it is, now I've talked 5 minutes and 13 seconds. It says it there, don't worry. And so the 4 questions I want to throw out, I'm actually not going to focus on them all because I don't have time, but this is what they are. So instead of obsessing about, should these public institutions be just facilitating and leveling and, God forbid, pick winners, what should the real questions be in terms of directionality? And what are the lessons to learn from the past, from the IT revolution, and from what we see today in the green revolution in terms of this directionality of public investments, the kinds of risk-taking organizations that are required, how do we assess this market shaping process so that we don't actually fall back, as we often do, into this kind of crowding out versus crowding in. Crowding in is still pretty negative, right? Crowding, crowding, that's negative. So we don't have a positive way to actually assess those institutions, whether it's the BBC in the UK, whether it's ARPA-E today really leading in many different innovations in the green tech sector, and that's a problem. And the whole risk-reward thing is a huge issue in terms of inequality. So if we want inclusive growth, we better have a proper understanding of who created that growth in the first place so we don't get this misalignment between who we're calling the risk takers and the rewards that we're actually then allowing to come through. So I'm going to do this very fast, but hey, I've got 14 minutes, which is plenty of time. So roots and directions. All I want to say here is anything that's interesting that has actually happened, as I already said, in the last 200 years of technological change. So big innovations, what actually impacted productivity across the entire economy, not just limited to particular sectors. So these general purpose technologies actually required this market shaping, market creation process from different public institutions, investing in very capital intensive, high risk areas all across the innovation chain. This is not, and let me repeat, this is not just about basic science. Everyone agrees the government's got to fund basic science. That's why I sound American, but I'm Italian. We left Italy so my dad could work at Princeton University with research financed by the Department of Energy in nuclear fusion. There is no debate about that. So let's not talk about that. Let's talk about the real role that these public institutions have played even beyond basic science, which is throughout the whole innovation chain. And I'm focusing here as an innovation economist on innovation as a lead creator, if you want, of wealth. And so this commitment, the depth and breadth of this commitment is spectacular. So lots of financing, this is just some examples with these acronyms of public investments in the basic research, lots downstream in applied research, and even more downstream in terms of actually providing the patient, long-term, committed finance that the innovators require, right? So VCs, as we know, venture capitalists are very exit-driven, want those returns to happen in 3 or 5 years, and that's why you need something called the Small Business Innovation and Research Program in the USA, or YASMA in Israel, or the European Investment Fund in Europe, actually providing that patient long-term finance. And this means taking massive risks. For all of these investments that are successful, there's lots of failures. We often admit this, of course, with the VC industry. This is usually my little theater thing, which I won't bore you with today, but I always often say, if you don't like what I'm saying, well, ask yourself what actually makes the smartphone smart. Of course, Apple's a great company. Of course, Steve Jobs is a genius. Of course, Sir John Ives is. Of course, they were important, but actually what Apple did was, in a very genius way, apply very important concepts of design and putting together, through architectural innovation, existing technologies that had actually been financed through public investment into something we call the smartphone. And the point is, what are those? The internet, GPS, touchscreen display, Siri. For each of those successes, there were many, many failures. But that's normal. That's what innovation is. We admit this again in the private sector. When the public sector fails, we don't, we then accuse it of being really stupid. So whether it's Solyndra in the modern era or Concorde in the past, we get very worried when we see these mistakes, when actually if you are a key part of the innovation process, then this is in fact about taking massive amounts of risks and also along the way screwing up again and again and again. The National Institutes of Health spend, after the Department of Defense, the second biggest budget from the public sector in the US, and they've actually been responsible for, and this has been documented by people like Marcia Angels, not just financing the background basic science, but also downstream financing some of the most important drugs, so new molecular entities with priority rating. These, in fact, are the revolutionary drugs that we often like to use that word revolutionary, again, just for business, and think that the state is in the background just creating these basic sort of investments in infrastructure. And this money, even after the crisis, has been increasing. In green technology, I've been doing a lot of research on this and who's actually financing some of the highest risk parts of clean tech, and luckily we have a wonderful database called Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and it's not surprising that the upper right-hand quadrant, where you have high capital intensity, high technological and market risk across the whole chain, tends to be financed by different types of public actors. Co-financed, yes, by the private sector. This is not about private not doing its investments, but this very large role, for example, of just 4 public banks out there in the world absolutely directing the investments in their own countries in this particular green direction is something that we, again, don't necessarily have words for. These development banks, that amount of money there is just 4 banks. 4 banks, the Chinese Development Bank, the German KfW, the European Investment Bank, and the Brazilian Development Bank, which you can bet will not be making many investments given what's happening in Brazil for the next couple of years. But the point is that if you just look at the KfW money and their energy vend policy, which is absolutely transforming their economy in this green direction beyond just renewable energy, this is much more than just counter-cyclical lending, which of course is required. This is directing that lending around that particular part of transformational growth that they're trying to achieve. We look also specific, I'm not going to go into this, but anyway, so different types of public finance, whether it's the ARPA-E's of this world or these public banks, are in fact still investing in some of the most high-risk, capital-intensive parts of green. Organizationally, what's interesting is if you look at the websites of these organizations, like ARPA-E, which is trying to replicate in the Department of Energy what DARPA did in Department of Defense, they are absolutely explicitly about, talking about themselves in terms of, God, this keeps stopping, of forming a new area, of directly financing a new landscape. They don't say the word market making, market shaping, but they have missions. And do we actually have words for this in economics? And the answer is no. We don't talk about these public organizations as having missions. They're there, again, as just sort of de-risking. And when they do have missions, and when they do start sort of trying to push the frontier, they are often accused, just think of the BBC in the UK, of crowding out the private sector, because the idea is that you have an existing market, and say the soap opera part of that market and public broadcasting should just be for the private sector, and the BBC should be there maybe to do boring documentaries of giraffes, the public good, or high quality news, but don't you dare, if you want, enter this area that we think is of the market. So you're just fixing the public good part. You're not allowed to do what might be seen as commercially viable stuff without this notion actually of, say, public value and social value as directing actually what these organizations have done. So going beyond the public good and actually directing their activities in spaces that are being directed by, again, a notion that we don't really talk about in economics. That's more for political science. I won't bore you with that. Now, this whole thing about welcoming risk also means that we have to build institutions that actually welcome failure. So learning organizations, Albert Hirschman, who, if you haven't read him, definitely read his work, had a very clear concept of this, of policy as process. He said, public organizations that have been really important across the world, and he was also looking specifically at developing countries, have been important in terms of also welcoming, if you want, serendipity, what he called the hiding hand. And really then the question is, is this actually what we're doing when we're creating our public organizations? Are we telling them to welcome failure, to become learning organizations, to take risks? And the answer is absolutely not. How this then impacts these issues of assessment that I was talking about is, you can imagine that if you have, again, an existing market versus actually pushing the frontiers of a new market, the indicators through which you will assess then your success in terms of those public investments will be very different. And first, just as background, all the investments that I look at both in the book but also this work on green tech are actually often direct investments. So these are the gray lines here. This particular graph is showing government support to businesses that want to be spending in research and development in different areas. And across the world, not only is there very different amounts of public money spent on this, but also different characteristics. And this gray lines, which are direct support, what we find in different studies that have looked at the coevolution of direct and indirect, is that the indirect kind of tax incentives, which assume that business already want to invest and are just sort of affecting the marginal decision, are really mainly successful in countries that have also sort of paved the way, created those animal spheres, created a new landscape, which then these sort of incentive mechanisms are sort of icing on the cake. There's a great quote in Keynes, which I think one should reflect a lot on, this wonderful letter he wrote to Roosevelt, where I think he was sort of getting to this, which he says, hold on a second, I use the word animal spirits, that makes you think of lions and wolves and tigers, when actually out there in the business community, often what we have are domesticated animals, gerbils and pussycats. And so the kind of policy you actually need to, say, just take away impediments for the private sector to then do their thing are very different from actually getting the private sector to even want to invest. And so the point is, in biotech, nanotech, the IT industry, and definitely in the emerging green tech industry, what we see is the role of these direct investments when they were done in intelligent ways, so mission-oriented, strategic agencies which were able to attract top talent, because yes, people matter, and people are attracted to work in mission-oriented agencies. That's why the US government gets Nobel Prize winners working for, directing agencies like Steve Chu directing DOE, which then sets up ARPA-E. These things matter. And yet, again, we often have different types of policies, whether it's the patent box in this country or all sorts of different tax incentives, which sort of miss this point. Measuring, again, this market creation versus market fixing process is a huge challenge. And again, it actually, we've been starting to look at different analyses that have been done both in terms of public banks, but also strategic national agencies like the BBC. And when the crowding out critique that I mentioned before is used, was there actually any attempt to measure the huge amounts of both spillovers that these agencies create, but also literally that distance there. And so finally, in terms of risk and rewards, and this is actually perhaps my most important point, all these kinds of investments, as I've already mentioned, require lots of failure. They require being a lead investor. They require setting up these agencies in a way that, again, actually attract people that know something about the area versus thinking they just have a lifelong, if you want, career in a public organization. But what it also requires is, mapping out over history and over different sectors what we actually know about who took the risks when and where. Let me just skip over that. So in some work with Bill Lazonic, we did this, and one of the key points is innovation is a cumulative process. It builds on itself. Think of it literally as a path-dependent cumulative process, which in the beginning, the returns are quite low, and then you have I normally put up my nice curve. If you then put all the different actors that were important in, say, setting up biotech for the 50 years that it was required, when is it actually that the venture capital industry entered? And the answer is they entered about 30 years after the National Institutes of Health did most of those investments I mentioned before. And the problem is if then we have a way of talking about certain actors as the risk takers, whether it's the entrepreneurs, the venture capitalists, et cetera, and others as just there as de-risking that sort of process, facilitating, that has actually then affected the way that we have allowed certain actors to, if you want, extract a certain amount of value beyond how much they actually put in. There it is. So let me just go to the actual big point, which is if you look at some of the most important private actors that were really important, say, for the ICT industry, so Bell Labs, which I'm sure you've heard of, which was an R&D laboratory inside AT&T, that laboratory actually came from a provocation, if you want, from government, asking AT&T, which was a monopoly at the time, to reinvest its profits back into production. Back into innovation, back into big innovation. So the question is, when you actually have the different actors which are equally confident and where the state admits it's actually been one of the lead investors, it actually has also more of a negotiating power also to be asking the business sector not just what sort of business-friendly policies do they want, what kind of taxes should be lowered, what kind of regulations should be eased in terms of red tape, but also what is the right deal in terms of this co-investment procedure. And one of my things is I think that today we absolutely don't have that kind of deal between public and private. We have record level hoarding. We have a serious investment problem, which some people talk about in terms of secular stagnation, but investment is in fact endogenous to the production system. And so when you have, if you want, the private actors, which recently, I would say since the 1970s, have become both ultra-financialized, spending on areas like buybacks. You can just look at some of these numbers here. They're absolutely huge. So more than 100% of net income being spent on a mix between share buybacks and dividends. This then becomes part of the, if you want, investment problem. And so our ambitions to achieve smart innovation-led growth are hurt by it. But more generally, this issue about, why is IPR even considered a right? Intellectual property rights? They're not rights. Contract. It's a contract. It should be negotiated as a contract. And so just like we do in defense, where there's lots of public spending in the beginning, and the prices then in the end are negotiated based on what the public sector did, we should also perhaps do that for drugs. Lastly, the Tesla kind of investment, $465 million from the state, same amount went to Solyndra. The reality is for every Tesla, you probably do have 7 or 8 Solyndras. Why don't we admit that these are investments and actually set them up like portfolios, where some of the upside might actually go into something called an innovation fund, precisely in order to cover those losses. And this is all important because it's about how we distribute the value that's created by having a more collective understanding of where the value actually came from in the first place.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Should I go here?
Oh, you do. Take a seat. Thank you. That's great. Now, DITA Helm is your respondent. DITA wrote a paper in the Oxford Review of Economic Policy some 30 years ago called The Economic Borders of the State, and did a recap of that very recently for our 30th anniversary. DITA, you have 5 to 10 minutes. I think we are going a little bit over on this one, but thank you very much.
Thanks, Cameron. I'll try and cut down what I was going to say so we get back on schedule. Okay, so the draft chapter is extremely ambitious, covers an enormous amount of territory, and as I detect, picks out 3 distinct but related questions. The first one, the paper starts off by talking about the relationship between innovation and inequality. There is an underlying theme of what should the state do, And the third one, which bubbles up all the way through, is how is wealth created? And innovation's clearly got something to do with the way wealth's created, but it's not the only component part. Let me make a few remarks. On innovation and inequality, it's a long discussion and a very interesting one because it's not the normal line that people take on inequality, but I would be amazed if one could explain the widening inequality in both developed countries and fast developing countries like China and kleptomaniac countries like Russia, if you'd explain it by the inability of the state to capture the gains from innovation. It seems to me rent-seeking, all sorts of reasons lie behind why parts of society have usurped what I would regard as more of the commonwealth. On what should the state do? Well, I think first of all it's very important to be very clear what the state is, and you rightly and importantly referred to Keynes on this. Keynes's notion of the state did not have a narrow conception. He thought the Arts Council of Great Britain, the BBC, and a whole set of what we'd call institutions in between were part of the state. The National Trust would have fitted in had it been around for him to put in that frame. And once you start thinking about the state in that very broad sense, then of course you would expect the state to do a lot more than otherwise was the case. And actually I think that that makes it more difficult to sort out who you want to do what. So if you think the National Trust is part of the state, then we can talk about the state managing natural assets. But, you know, I'm a vice president of a wildlife trust. We don't think of ourselves as part of the state. We have a governance structure, trustees and all those kind of things. So this is a much more fluid area. And the issue about how wealth created is a huge question. So what I wanted to do in the 2 or 3 minutes I had was to focus down on some quite narrow points that come up within the paper. The first point, and the point that I walked away having finished read the paper, is this. Is there anything the private sector should do? Right? Rather than the other way around is what should the public sector do? Okay, so in particular think of two things here. One is a strong case is made that innovation is very much in the domain of the state. But if you think about it in terms of the cost of capital, it's an argument essentially that equity capital should be state capital in significant degree, and that presumably if the cost of capital for the state is lower than the private sector, because it has a bigger portfolio, presumably it should do all investment in the economy because it has a cost of capital advantage. Now that's because that doesn't stand up because you don't really think what equity risk means to the state. And that feeds through into the issues which economics has got a lot to say about, which is incentive structures and the way in which equity risk is reflected in state decision-making and in private decision-making. And this gets terribly bundled up with the idea that all the state does is borrow and have debt and bonds and forget the equity component of the state and the state's balance sheet and the risks that go with it, which I think is a fruitful area to develop in the paper. And we have all the stuff on principal agent. We have a large literature on government failure, regulatory failure. I've written extensively on that. I'd just say as an aside, I wouldn't just dismiss it. It's a serious issue about incentive structures in government and in the private sector. We have very good literatures on both, and we have lots of empirical studies. And in the UK, some of that's informed by the experience of the state making equity bets. We have the entire history of the nationalised industries to draw upon. We have the appalling decisions made by the CGB, nuclear power, choice of technologies, etc. We have lots and lots of examples to draw upon. And by the way, the green example, I think, is a horrendously bad example, particularly in Germany, since Germany, if you look at the numbers, has gone from nuclear to coal, from gas to coal, and has built some of the most expensive current generation of renewables in the world of arguable and questionable value. So it's not QED. Some people think it's a good idea, some people think it's not, but it's not a straightforward example by any means. And we have lots of evidence more generally from countries. We can observe countries that have a bigger state sector versus a bigger private sector. We can observe countries that take particular roles in the state and others that don't. And I wouldn't say that the evidence sparks to mind that the most successful economies out there in the world are the ones that really have got the biggest states. That doesn't mean they're necessarily the biggest failures. It's the design of the state and the form the state takes, where exactly those economic boundaries are drawn. And in my mind, and something I've worked on extensively, in the core infrastructures, and I think about that in a more general way, the development of a relationship between the private sector and the public sector, development of things like regulatory asset bases, etc., are part and parcel of how one should think about both the financing of the economy and also the ways of both enhancing and limiting the role of the states. So what I would say in comment is the innovation inequality question is an extraordinarily important one. It's worth a chapter in its own right. The economic borders of the state is a huge topic. Some of the dimensions of innovation are very under-researched. And the question of how wealth is created is a massive one. And it's great you put that on the table for our conference today. Thank you.